Hey everyone, this is Dr. Drizzle and welcome to the National Parks Expedition Challenge. Today we are in Beatrice, Nebraska at the Homestead National Historical Park. We are at a place that's a little different from most of our national park adventures. We're standing in front of this great cabin with our new friend Ranger Jonathan. Hey Ranger Jonathan, how are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. How about yourself?
Great. There's so many things around here that I want to talk about, like so many very cool things. But before we start, how did you get to this park?
So I first came to the National Park Service at a park in Michigan in the Upper Peninsula called Keweenaw National Historical Park. And I actually got there as a student in what's called the Pathways program, sort of a summer internship type thing. And I wasn't really sure, I was just looking for a summer job and I found that one, applied to it. And let me tell you, I fell in love.
Nice.
Loved it so much, loved the area, loved being a park ranger, everything about it. So I went back the next summer, and after graduating, they contacted me here at Homestead and said, hey, we have a position open for our historian and would love to have you. So here I am, and it's been a dream come true.
Well, that's pretty interesting because a lot of times we hear that rangers, have to work multiple seasons and then apply to a lot of places. So they came after you. And I think that's because you're an historian. So you got your degree in history, I'm
Correct.
assuming,
Mm-hmm.
and an historian. So what does a historian do?
So a historian wears a lot of different hats. One of the most important things I do is just working with our resources, our things like our historic structures, our cabin here, the Freeman School, some of our various archaeological sites, and making sure that those sites are well protected, that they're available and accessible for visitors and future generations to enjoy. So that's one of the biggest priorities, but also doing things like historical research, helping tell the story of homesteading, sharing that, giving programs, doing
Wow.
field trips, all sorts of stuff.
So definitely a lot of hats under
lot of
one
hats.
great park ranger hat. So the exciting part of this adventure today is that we were actually here 4 years ago and we filmed like a 4-minute teaser to start the National Parks Expedition Challenge. And today we're celebrating number 72 with you
Wow.
guys. So again, so excited to be here. So Homestead National Historical Park, tell us about it.
Yeah, so Homestead National Historical Park, and the name is actually brand new as of this year. We were originally created in 1936 as Homestead National Monument of America. We're located in Beatrice, Nebraska, on the site of the very first homestead in the country, which was claimed by Daniel Freeman in 1863. So homesteading started during the Civil War, signed into law by President Lincoln, basically to promote westward expansion across the United States. And it wasn't just here in Nebraska thing. It was 30 different states across the country, from Florida in the far southeast part of the country, all the way to Alaska and all the states in between. So we happen to be on the first site, but we're not the Daniel Freeman National Historic Site. I think something cool about our park is the size and scope of what we talk about. We're originally created as Homestead National Monument of America, and that's pretty unique. Right, because we talk about the whole country, 30 different states, the millions of people whose lives were impacted by this law, and what exactly that's meant for our country's history.
Well, as I look around this place, I can't see it all just in one site. Like there's multiple acres of this place. So what would we find here if students come to visit, which we hope they do? What are some places they'd be able to visit here?
Yeah, so we have our Heritage Center and our Education Centers, which are the main museum and exhibit spaces here at the park. We also have the Freeman Cabin, or the Palmer Riper Cabin, which we're standing right in front of here, and the Freeman School, which is a one-room schoolhouse from the 1800s. And then we've got our 100 acres of tall grass prairie and 60 acres of woodlands.
And lots of, not replicas, are these real implements that we find around the park?
Absolutely, yeah. They're all original implements that homesteaders would have been using in the 1800s and 1900s to help them farm their land.
Well, I know you're a historian, but what about any cool animals around here? Do you have any that hang out with you?
Oh, sure, yeah. So the tallgrass prairie, the restored prairie, has all sorts of wildlife in it. In fact, just about a month ago, we did a deer survey to figure out how many deer live here in the park, and I believe the final tally was about 35 deer. So,
and I've heard quite a few birds around here this morning. So tall grass prairie, is that sort of the ecosystem or what we're going to find here?
it is, yeah. So most of Nebraska historically would have been tall grass prairie. Now it's in decline. Something like 95% of what used to be tall grass prairie has now been converted to farmland or to other purposes. But yeah, tall grass prairie here in southeast Nebraska for sure.
What stories, are there any interesting stories that have been told about this place?
So there have been, I think since we're talking about the prairie, one of the most compelling things is that, if you look at the prairie, you think, okay, that's what it's always looked like, right? But of course, under the Homestead Act, you had to farm that land. All of the prairie that you see today, that's restored prairie, and it's actually the oldest restored prairie in the National Park Service.
Okay.
And the second oldest in the country. That happened right after we became a park in the 1930s. They immediately thought, well, we want people to see what homesteaders, the first people that were coming out here to claim their land, what they saw, and so they started restoring that prairie.
If I were living back in the 1800s and wanted to homestead, what were the requirements then?
Yeah, so you had to be 21 or the head of a household. You had to either be a U.S. citizen or declare your intent to become one. So that meant that immigrants were welcome to Homestead. They just had to start the process of becoming citizens. And you had to live on the land for 5 years and make improvements. So things like building a house to live in. You had to cultivate the land, so either growing crops or raising livestock. And then after you'd done all that for 5 years, then you received it.
And was it up to 160 acres? Is that what I read?
Originally, yeah, up to 160 acres. You could claim less if you wanted, but it capped at 160. There were some later laws. The Homestead Act actually lasted a long, long time, more than 100 years. And some of those later laws made it so that you could claim 320 acres and eventually even 640 acres, so a full square mile of land.
Well, in this small cabin here, that reminds me sort of the tiny house movement, can you tell us a little bit about who would have lived here?
Yeah, so this was the Palmer-Eppard cabin. George Washington Palmer, who was a homesteader about 14 miles northeast, built this cabin in 1867. And believe it or not, looking at this cabin, this would have been something of a luxurious house in the 1860s, 1870s. You can see that it's a log cabin, and can't see it from this angle, but there's brick in the roof as well. So a log and brick structure at a time when a lot of homesteaders were building what was called a sod house. So literally taking the prairie dirt and turning that into what they were living in. Just because there were so few trees that lumber was a pretty scarce resource.
Well, how many would have lived in, or how many did live in this house? Do you know?
Yeah, so mom, dad, and then 10 kids. 12 people.
Kids. Well, as we look inside of it, it makes me think they had to be stacked on top of each other, but I guess they were resourceful.
I guess so. Now, there is a second story. You can see the stairs going up there, but yeah, it still would have been pretty crowded, I think. So it's a 14 by 16 foot house and 10 people in it.
Well, I guess the original tiny house movement began here in Beatrice at the Homestead. So you talked about resources, which I think is really cool, because as we look around and see all these implements out here, let's talk about that for a minute. So were these implements around when the first homesteaders were laying their claims?
So some of them were, especially some of the simpler implements. Of course, things like the plow, which would have been one of the foundational pieces of turning the prairie into a farm. And even farming 20, 30 acres with simple equipment like a plow and a beast of burden, it was time-consuming, back-breaking work. We've got a couple of acres that we farm here today, and just doing 2 acres really gives you an appreciation for how much work they're putting in. But of course, like anyone else, they were always thinking of, well, how do we do this better? How do we do it more efficiently so we can farm more land for less time, less effort? So in the homestead era, you start to see more and more advanced equipment. And so some of the stuff we have here is late 1800s, early 1900s, and you go from having a plow to what you see today, things like combines harvesting the fields.
Well, it just makes us know that we have to, continually increase our technology and our know-how to keep up with demand. So that brings me to our UN global goal, which is going to be goal number 9. It talks about industry, infrastructure, and innovation. So kids, what I want you to think about is, I want you to do some research on your area, where you live, if it's a farming area, if it's an urban area, and I want you to create a timeline. So the first homestead was in
1863.
So start at 1863. That's going to be your piece where you start and look at the development of your community, your town, and your city from 1863 until today. And find those implements, if you will, those pieces of technology that helped your town grow into what it is today. List those. You can create a timeline on Google Docs or on Microsoft Word, and then share that with us, making sure you put the different years when these different resources were created. But then we want you to come up with the next best thing. So if you live in a community right now that depends on farming, what is the next thing that you can build, design, or create that will help the farmers? If you live in a city area and you're thinking about maybe transportation and how transportation has changed over the years, what is the next thing that you can create, design, or brainstorm that will help your community, city, or town grow even further? I think that would be interesting, and as a historian, that's kind of a cool thing for kids to think about, how things have changed over time and how they're the next big thing out there.
Absolutely.
They're the ones that are creating stuff. So we want to make sure that you tag us on social media, hashtag #NatParkChallenge, at Dacia92, and also tag Homestead. You're going to see the credentials at the bottom of the screen. So I know we're usually probably more leaning towards science parks when we're on this event, just because we haven't been to a lot of history parks yet, but I'm sold. Like this, just the history of this is so interesting, and it intersects with science, right? The whole idea of plowing and your gardening and stuff. There are kids out there right now that are history buffs. I know they are. They read every history book they can get. They know all about what's happened in our country, especially our 4th graders who are watching. What advice would you give them about maybe wearing your uniform one day? You can just tell them right there.
So we're always excited to have volunteers and students coming to work at the park in the YCC program, the Youth Conservation Corps program. And no matter what you're interested in, we have opportunities here. Last year our YCCs did some work in Cub Creek, and they were digging for mussels living in the mud in the creek beds. So if that sounds fun to you, we've got stuff like that. If you're looking to do some history work, we've got plenty of opportunities there. If you want to get out on the trails, help build trails. If you want to work with helping protect some of our historic resources and maybe painting the cabin, whatever you're interested in, we'd be happy to have you.
And one more thing before we go, I noticed that we're looking at right now this representation of these states that have homesteads cut out of them. Can you tell us a little bit about the display that we're seeing?
Yeah, so there were 30 different homesteading states from Florida in the Far East all the way to Alaska. And in each of those states, we've got this display that shows what percentage of that state was homesteaded. So in some of them, if you look at Ohio, for example, it's a pretty small land area because there wasn't much land left to claim. But in some of them, especially here in Nebraska and the Dakotas and Montana and New Mexico, you see a huge, huge percentage of that land that was settled by the Homestead Act. It's hundreds of thousands of people in some of these states, literally millions across the entire country, for 270 million total acres of land, which is an area about the size of California and Texas put together.
Well, here's another assignment for you kids. I want you to think about homesteading in your state. So see if you see your state displayed up here on our wall, and if not, find out why. Like, find out the history behind it and why homesteading wasn't happening there. And it could have been because your state wasn't created yet. You never know, right? We got to talk about the history. Thank you so much for having us here today. I'm excited to do some exploring on our own and look around and sort of walk in places where other people walked and sort of hear their stories. One of my favorite stories growing up was Little House on the Prairie, and finding where Laura Ingalls Wilder lived. And I think their house was bigger than this, and they only had like 5 people in there. So I'm trying to figure out how they are all going to get in there. But thanks again for having us. Kids, Homestead National Historical Park. You're watching it today. You're going to research all about it. But then once you're able to get to this park, it takes a little while to get here, but you could spend the whole day just walking around and listening and seeing if you can hear the stories that were told. And if you can't, historian ranger here, Jonathan, will be able to help you. Thanks so much for joining us. This is Dr. Drizzle and Ranger Jonathan, and we're out of here.